Greetings, Latin 2. Here we are starting a new lesson, lesson 30, on the perfect passive participle or perfect participle passive. And we're going to talk about why we're learning this one before we learn present active participles and things like that. So anyway, we're probably going to stick in this lesson through the end of the quarter, and I'll probably try to do one live tutoring session with you next week. So I've tried to finish up this quarter kind of easy for you. I realize it's a challenge with our distance head. Anyway, let's move on. So you'll want to be on page 325, and we're really focusing here on the fourth principal part. So if you wanted to look in your grammar book, you might want to have open here the section on verbs, and that would be page 41. And you'll notice there that when it talks about principal parts, the fourth principal part is the perfect participle passive. Okay? Now, what are participles? And again, it tells you right here at the top of page 325. Here's an English, though. Participle is a verbal that is used as an adjective, most often ending in ing or ed. Ing in the present, ed in the past, or in the passive. It's based on a verb and therefore expresses action. However, they function as adjectives and they modify nouns or pronouns. Okay, so you got to realize that these are verbal adjectives. Verbal adjectives. So there's in English present and past participles. So asked, what kind of question was it? It was a question that was asked. Eaten. What kind of meal was it? It was an eaten meal. So here's some English examples. The crying baby had a wet diaper. What kind of baby was it? It was a crying baby. Or you could say the baby who had been crying had a wet diaper. Okay, that might be how you'd see it in a Latin book. Shaken, he walked away from the wrecked car. What kind of man was it? Who was he? He was the shaken man. What kind of car was it? It was a wrecked car. So again, you can see how we've taken the verb wreck and we've turned it into an adjective, the wrecked car. The burning log fell off the fire. What kind of log was it? It was a burning log. So we've taken the verb burn and we've turned it into a participle that modifies the word log. Smiling, she hugged the panting dog. What kind of woman was it? It was a smiling woman. The woman, or you could say, the woman who was smiling hugged the panting dog. Okay. Smiling, she hugged the dog who was panting. What kind of dog was it? It was a panting dog. So again, these are verbal adjectives, and sometimes it'll come up as a participial kind of phrase. That's the way we're often going to be using them here in our lesson. So we're answering the question, what kind of noun? That's what adjectives always do, like the table. What kind of table was it? It was a hard table. It was a brown table. It was a round table. It was a constructed table. See, there would be a participle. Okay. It was a broken table, right? There's another participle, a verbal adjective, taking the word break and applying it to the table. Okay. So participles are adjectives. Now I want you to make sure you're open here to page 326 and looking at these examples. Caesar, having been disturbed by many messages, led new legions into Gaul. That's the first example here at the top of page 326. And so perturbatus, having been disturbed, is what is modifying Caesar. Could we say the disturbed by many messages Caesar led new legions into Gaul? Yeah, sure, we could say that. That's very awkward. And so that's why you will often have it written out as kind of like this participial phrase that's modifying the noun. Okay, so notice how perturbatus is nominative singular, agreeing with Caesar. It's functioning just like adjectives have to, where it has to be in a particular case. Okay, and so again, it'll have endings. These fourth principle parts will have endings like adjectives, and you could go back here to chapter 21 just to kind of remind yourself when you first saw the fourth principle part, when it was being used as the perfect passive verb. So if you look at page 208, lesson 21, that's when you first came across, and you'll see that's decline like manus, mania, manum. Well, that's a first, second declension adjective. And now we're actually going to be using it as an adjective instead of as a verb. Okay? I'll talk about this a little bit more in a second. So the way we formed the perfect passive verb, you can see at the bottom of page 208, take the perfect participle passive, and then you add a form of the word sum. Okay, we'll talk about that in a second, but I just want to make sure that you understand that we have had this fourth principle part before, but now we're using it as it actually is, which is as a participle. So what kind of Caesar was it? It was the Caesar who was disturbed, or the Caesar having been disturbed. Okay. Caesar fortified with a rampart, the hill seized by the cavalry. So now we're back at page 326, and we're looking at the second one. And what they're doing is they're drawing a line from the participle or the adjective and what noun it is modifying. In this case, it's not modifying Caesar. Occupatum is a accusative singular, and so it's modifying column. What kind of hill was it? It was the hill that had been seized. Caesar fortified with a rampart, the hill seized by the cavalry. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with here. And you can keep going through this here, and that might even be a good exercise for you. Remember that adjectives of quality like to follow the nouns that they modify, and I think you're going to see that in the exercises here. You certainly see it in number 1. So you might want to draw a line from the participle to the noun that it's modifying. And it may often be going backwards, right? Because the adjectives of quality will follow the noun that they're modifying. So why are you learning the perfect passive participles first? Why not an active present? Wouldn't that be easier? That was the first verb you learned, right? Laudo, mitto, audio. Well, it's because for 10 chapters now, you've been using the fourth principle part. The fourth principle part of any verb is the perfect passive participle. What's been different is so far you've been adding a form of the verb sum in order to create the perfect passive verb. Okay, so Caesar was led, or Caesar was disturbed. Caesar was disturbed. Okay, so now we're turning those verbs that use the form sum, and we're turning them, Caesar having been disturbed does something. Okay, so that's the reason why we're doing the perfect passive participles first, is because you've already encountered the fourth principle part of each verb, and the fourth principle part of each verb is a perfect passive participle. So again, if you go back to page 325, excuse me, and you can see underlined there the fourth principle parts, look at page 41, and you'll see that at the bottom in your grammar, is the fourth principal part. And there's a footnote there explaining why they give it in the masculine. And again, where you encountered this so far in your book was the passive perfects, which are on page 58 of your grammar and 59. And again, we're going to be working with this again, but now we're going to be taking away this form of sum that makes it a verb and simply using it as a participle. So here's what we had before back in lesson 21. Deus laudatus est. God was praised. God has been praised. Perfect passive verb. So I had to add that form of the verb sum, and I'm adding it in the present tense, but it doesn't mean it's a present tense verb. It is a perfect passive verb. Here's another example. Galli victi sunt. Galli victi sunt. The Gauls were conquered, or the Gauls have been conquered. It depends on how you want to translate the perfect tense of the verb. But I'm adding that form of the verb sum in order to create a verb, and we're going to be taking that away now. Note, you have to use a present form of sum for a perfect passive. You use an imperfect form for a pluperfect passive, and a future form for a future perfect passive. The present tense form does not mean that it is a present tense verb. That is a problem that some of you are still having. You got to nip that in the bud. When you see that perfect passive participle form, you're going to be either dealing with a perfect participle or a perfect verb. And so don't get confused when you see that present form of the verb sum. It's still a perfect passive verb. When you don't have this form of sum, you're dealing with a participle. That's what we're dealing throughout lesson 30, and now we're going to be using it throughout the rest of the book. Now, bottom of page 326, there's a few qualifications. Intransitive verbs, and again, intransitive verbs are ones that don't take an object, so they would be ones like sleep, walk, right? Because they're kind of involving your own motion, and so they don't take an object outside of you. And again, your book generally will mark a verb as intransitive with int or intr. And so those are going to use the neuter forms. And in fact, you'll see some textbooks, instead of using the masculine form like this textbook used, will usually always give the neuter form. Also, 327, impeditus is going to be translated as encumbered or difficult. So the soldiers, encumbered by baggage, found it hard to fight or whatever. Were often conquered or something like that. Okay. So just be aware of that. Okay. Be aware of that. Again, we're using the new vocabulary here on 327. We're using some compound verbs where we take a preposition. So we've had moveo, right? Moveo, move. Comoveo, arouse. So it's like a more intensive version of moveo. We've had duco, lead, right? Dux is the leader. Duco is lead. Aduco is to lead to. So the preposition is giving it direction. Okay. And now we've got the verbal form. So we've had impedimenta, right? Baggage. Now we're going to have the verb impedio, but it's going to be used largely in this fourth principal part. It's a fourth conjugation, regular verb. And so it's going to be referring to things like hindered or impeded or encumbered. Okay. And then auctoritas comes directly into English as authority. All right. So let's look here at exercise 338. This is your homework, not due till Monday. And let's look at number 1. Valere spe communa salutis adducti equites in agmen Romanum miserunt. Okay, so I want you to look at that. I want you to try to identify the verbs or the verbal adjectives, participles. Well, again, go to the end of the sentence usually to find your verb. And you go to the end of the phrase, and you've got kind of a participial phrase here. So you've got a verb, miserunt, which again is not related at all to the adjective misera. It is from mito. Remember that. And you got the participle adducti from adduco, adducere, adduxi, adductus. So we've turned the singular adductus into a plural adducti, modifying barbari. So you could draw a line there from adducti and draw it back to barbari. So the verb is a perfect active, miserunt. The participle is a perfect passive, adducti. The barbarians, having been led on by hope. So there's your perfect passive participle. What kind of barbarians were they? They were the kind of barbarians led on by hope. They were the barbarians led on by hope. And you almost don't even need that having been, right? That's kind of a more formal perfect passive, but you could just say the barbarians led on by hope. They were the barbarians led on by hope. So what were they doing? What did these barbarians led on by hope do? Well, the barbarians led on by hope sent, miserunt, from mito, mitura, misi, mises. Okay? So they sent cavalry against the battle line of the Romans, or the Roman battle line. Now again, don't forget, in with the accusative, agmen, does not mean in, it means into, upon, against. It's used in these battle contexts usually to mean against. Okay? You might send forces into Gaul, but if it's an enemy battle line, if it's an enemy soldiers, it's going to mean against or upon. Example 2, number 8. Centurio ad hiberna ad hostibus appugnata auxilia deduxit. Now again, can you spot the participle, and can you draw a line to the noun that it is modifying? Because again, these are adjectives. You got one verb, deduxit, and you got a participle, appugnata. Appugnata. What number is the verb? It's singular, right? What number is appugnata? Well, it could be feminine singular, but in this case, it is neuter plural. It's neuter plural. So the verb, again, is perfect active, and I think that's what you're going to find a lot through these exercises, or perfect active verbs, if they're indicative verbs. But the participle is perfect passive. The centurion led the reinforcements, auxilia, to the camp, ad hiberna. What kind of camp was it? The camp which had been occupied by the enemy. The camp occupied, perfect passive, occupied by the enemy, seized by the enemy. That's the camp that the centurion led the reinforcements to. All right, your assignment is, first of all, make sure you watch the YouTube video on perfect passive participles. You're to do 1 to 10. Again, I've tried to make things a little easier, stretch things out here by only giving you that finishing of reading 25 this week and this. And we may only do one more homework, probably from exercise 339 before the end of the quarter. Okay. And you will have at least one homework dropped from your grade, but really try to get them all in, because again, you need to be learning. You need to be growing and learning and acquiring this new knowledge. So it's not just about the grade, it's about actually learning Latin better. Okay? All right. God bless you. And hopefully we will see you back in school soon. Bye-bye.